So you guys know me pretty well by now that I love to dissect the elements of storytelling. I'm just fascinated by it, always have been, probably always will be. It's just always been one of my favorite things to do. But there is a particular trope in storytelling that has become so common that it's moved past cliche and it has become expectation. It's a trope that you have seen hundreds, if not thousands of times in your own life and in stories that you have. I would even go so far as to call it the trope. And that trope is, of course, the happily ever after. Disney ruined an entire generation with that. But we love the happily ever after to the point that we come to expect it. If we don't get it in a movie, we notice it right away. It even jars us, and oftentimes those endings that are a little ambiguous or even, dare I say, not happy tend to stick with us because they stand out like a sore thumb. We love to see the hero ride off into the sunset after vanquishing the villain. We love to see that the couple have finally expressed their feelings towards one another and they're going to spend the rest of their lives together. We love it when the main character has overcome whatever it is they needed to. They got that job promotion. We love it when the two friends just give us that sense they're going to be friends forever. We love the happily ever after. But there's an element to that we oftentimes don't think about. I'm not trying to be the guy who rains on the parade here, but oftentimes a lot of characters' happily ever afters can be disasters, if not the nightmare scenario of other characters that are in that story. We never look at it from another character's perspective. Never. We kind of just take things at face value. We see it in the perspective that's presented to us. That's the only way that we look at it. But we oftentimes, if we really start to think about what would this scenario look like for this person in the story, well, it changes everything for it. Take, for example, a particular character. This character has found out that the woman that he has very vocally expressed his feelings towards has been captive, been made captive, held against her will, imprisoned by a monstrous animal. So he brazenly heads off and goes and risks life and limb to go and save her. We would call that character noble, right? We would look at him as being an absolute hero of the story. And yet, that exact character is painted as the villain in Beauty and the Beast. Never thought about Gaston that way, did you? All he is trying to do is rescue Belle from what he believes to be a monster that has held her captive against her own will. And what does he get for his trouble? He gets thrown into an endless void and presumed dead. Hashtag justice for Gaston. Or take, for example, what I consider to be the lowest form of storytelling that there is, the Hallmark Christmas movie. Good Lord, do I hate those things. Every single one of those plays out roughly the same way. There's a girl who works at a great job, who's got a great fiancé in the big city, but for some reason she's brought back to her hometown where she meets and falls in love with the guy that she went to high school with, who owns a farm or a Christmas tree growing place or a hot chocolate stand with a thinly veiled Christmas element to it. She falls in love with him after only spending 3 days with that guy, to the point that she quits her job and dumps her fiancé. Meanwhile, the part that you don't see in those movies is that the only reason her boyfriend or fiancé has been so distant is because he's been working on a great thing that is going to make him a partner at his firm to set the two of them up for life. And now he has a broken heart, having to pick up the pieces of his life and start all over again with somebody new. Or the company that she has just quit is now having to scramble because she, of course, was, every movie's the same thing. She's a high up in that firm, so they got to try to figure out her client list. They got to try to find the passwords that only she knew. They're scrambling, and there's some employee that works there who is just losing hair because of how stressed out he is now. Never looked at it from that perspective, did you? The next time you watch a Hallmark Christmas movie, or fellas, the next time your wife forces you to watch a Hallmark Christmas movie, poke holes in the story. It makes them a lot more fun to watch. But that's the way that we tend to view things in every form of storytelling. We only get wrapped up in the story of the hero or the destined couple to be, and we don't look at that same story from the mindset of those who are around it. We don't look at these stories through different perspectives to see what it might look like. And if we do, suddenly those main characters or that lovable couple start to look like self-centered monsters who leave nothing but wreckage in their wake for the people that are around them. The thing is that sometimes the happily ever after for somebody, it could be one of the worst things to ever happen to somebody else. It could lead them to pain. It could create chaos. It could even destroy their lives, all because somebody else got to have a happily ever after. There is just a part of our brain that is wired to only look at things from one perspective. This isn't just true in storytelling. I would make the argument that a lot of the consistent disagreements that we see happening all around us only persist because one or both sides refuse to see things from the other's point of view. Most of the time when we face disagreements in our lives, it is because we are only looking at things from what benefits me. And we don't try to view things from the other side's point of view or try to see how they could come to this decision. And so the decision that we think is what's best, they view it as the worst thing that could possibly happen. We don't look at it from that perspective because it only seems like what could be a good thing for one person might be a disaster for someone else. Sometimes even the choices of that one person that seem absolutely harmless, seem like there's no way it could ever hurt anybody else in this whole scenario, can lead to devastation, to pain, and to misery for people that were simply never even thought of as being affected by that outcome. But because of those choices being made, now we or others are forced to sift through the wreckage that might not have been intended in the first place, but is there nonetheless. And we're left with the question of why this pain had to happen. Last week, we saw the conclusion of Jacob's story. And I don't think we could have possibly come up with a better happily ever after, right? I mean, to find out that the son that he absolutely loved, that he thought had died, is not only still alive, but is actually a very prominent and important person, not just in the nation that he's residing in, but in the world at large at that particular time. Joseph was such a prominent and important person that he was the one who was deciding who gets food during a great famine that encountered many different nations. And so because of his important and prominent decision, he invites Jacob and his brothers and their wives and their children to move down to Egypt with him. So that way he can make sure that his family is taken care of, that they're provided for. And we get this great happily ever after where Jacob gets to spend the last few remaining years of his life not only with the son that he thought was dead, but he gets to live it up with the son he thought was dead. We get this beautiful moment where Joseph and his brothers make a final sense of peace, that they've completely and truly buried that hatchet to the point they poured concrete over top of it, as he promises to not only take care of them, but to make sure that their families are taken care of as well. And then Joseph finally dies for real this time at a ripe old age, with his family around him, his loved ones that he thought were gone forever are truly and utterly surrounding him at every turn. It's a beautiful, happily ever after. And so it's easy for us sometimes to view that story as done, especially when we turn the page from the end of Genesis into a whole brand new book, right? We have this way in our brains that once we turn the page on from one book of the Bible to the next one, we think that means that the story is over. But when we get to Exodus chapter 1, our text for today, the story is not done. It's just entering a new phase. Right, we've said this before, but it's so easy for us to forget this. That in Genesis chapter 11, the narrative shifts focus to focus on solely Abraham. But from that point all the way through to, I would even go so far as to say, is the end of the Gospels, we're still talking about one family. And at the beginning of Exodus chapter 1, it kind of seems like things are going pretty well for this family. Yes, they're in Egypt. Yes, that's not the place where they were intended to be, but hey, we're here and things are going well for us. Because when we look at verses 6 and 7, it tells us, then Joseph died, all his brothers and all that generation, but the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. The generation that had come to Egypt in the first place, the generation of the happily ever after, well, they passed on. But the other generation themselves, they're continuing the growth that has already started. We talked about this a couple of weeks ago with Jacob, that he got to see some of the early seeds of God's fulfillment of the promise he made all the way to Abraham, that he was going to grow them into a great nation. Well, now we're just a generation removed, and it looks like we're making some pretty good headway here. These folks are popping out kids left, right, front, and center. It says they grew exceedingly. So it seems like everything is going about as well as it possibly could be. Everything is going great, right? Until it's not. See, you get a generation or two removed, and suddenly nobody remembers what your grandpa did for the whole country. Nobody even remembers your grandpa's name. And verse 8 tells us, now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. If we look at that in a vacuum, this verse seems kind of fine, right? Like there's a new leader. He's not really well versed in his history of what's taken place in the nation, but it's going to be fine, right? Well, even if you look at it in a vacuum and just focus on this one sole verse, you get the feeling this could be problematic. Because now there's a king who's over this whole nation, and he has no idea what our father, our grandfather, our great-grandfather did for this country. He has no idea the ways that he saved us during the worst famine that we could have ever experienced. And for the Israelites, this is going to become problematic. Everything was great, and suddenly there's a new king. And this new king is seeing how these Israelites are just somehow everywhere. Like you can't spit without hitting an Israelite in Egypt. And he gets it in his head that there's a problem with this. Because they are not native Egyptian, they may have different viewpoints. They may make decisions that we don't like. They may turn against us. Whether that's true or not, it doesn't really matter because it's in the leader of the whole nation's head. And he starts stirring others up with it. And in verses 10 and 11, he lays out what his plan is. He says, come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply. And if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land. Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burden. They built for Pharaoh's store cities, Pithom and Ramus. In an effort to try to combat this startling growth of these foreigners living amongst us, to try to combat this continued growth of the Hebrew people, this new Pharaoh gets it in his head, well, let's treat them poorly. Let's make them be the ones who have to do all the heavy lifting around here. Let's give them only the jobs that we don't want to have. And maybe it'll tire them out so much that they can't keep reproducing. That if we're so mean to them, if we break their spirits, if we give them all this heavy labor, maybe that will help curb this population boom that they're experiencing. He's making their lives worse just because they have the audacity to have big families. Interesting. But it doesn't work. Kind of love that about them, right? He's going to try to make things worse for him, but they're not letting it get to him because verse 12 tells us, but the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and the more they spread abroad. At least something's going right for them. And the Egyptians, this part of this verse makes me scared though. And the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel. See, now the leader has not only informed them that, hey, these guys are growing, multiplying, now everybody else is starting to see it too. And now all the conspiracy theories are starting to float around. Now all the ideas of what could possibly happen are starting to float around. These people are starting to take over. And if we don't do something about it, they might turn against us. It's difficult to look at this from the Egyptians' perspective, isn't it? Because we see these people as, this is the heroes of the story. This is, as we're reading through Scripture, this is the family that we're focused on. But to the Egyptians, if we look at it from their perspective for just a moment, yeah, we can kind of see how this would be scary, right? They hold no loyalty to us. Many of us don't know why they're here in the first place. And so if we don't find some way to curb this, this could wind up going horribly for our people, because how do we know that these folks aren't going to rise up and take over the nation from us? Fear has an interesting way of messing with people's brains, doesn't it? And so they come up with another solution. Pharaoh goes so far as to go even worse. Because verses 13 and 14 tell us, so they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and in all kinds of work in the field. In all their work, they ruthlessly made them work as slaves. I don't think there's ever been a culture or a context where the idea of slavery is a good thing. Giving them hard work, oppressive labor, that didn't work, so let's just turn it into full-blown slavery. They make them do the worst, the most back-breaking labor that they can possibly come up with. And if they don't do it right, or if they do something that we don't like, or if they just look at us wrong, well, now that they're slaves, we can beat them. We can break their bodies while we break their spirits. In some cases, we can kill them. When the population of this people became too threatening, the solution was stop treating them as people and start treating them as property. They were so threatened by people just having kids that the solution became to stop treating them as people altogether. How does it come to that point? We're so determined to stop this population control that we're not going to view them as people, we're going to view them as property. And maybe that'll finally be the thing that does it. Well, here's the thing. We're at least given the impression that that doesn't work too. Say what you will about the Hebrew people in Exodus. My goodness, they are ready to go at all times. Right? We're given the impression that this doesn't work because later on Pharaoh has to come up with another solution, right? They're still, somehow in the midst of this horrendous treatment that we are treating them with, they're still able to reproduce. It's still happening. And so Pharaoh calls the midwives for the Hebrews and he tells them in verse 16, he comes up with a final solution. And I use that term very literally. Because it says in verse 16, when you serve as midwife to the Hebrew women and you see them on their birth stool, if it is a son, you shall kill him. But if it's a daughter, she can live. See, now we're no longer talking about the idea of population control. We're talking about full-blown extermination. Genocide. The midwives, they don't do this because they want to obey God. Instead, they fear God more than Pharaoh. That's probably the right concept to have. But they come up with this excuse as to why they're not doing this, why they're doing this. And I think it's the best excuse ever in all of human history. I've shared this with you before in a sermon around this text beforehand. But my goodness, I just love it so much, I feel like it has to be mentioned here, because here's the midwife's excuse in verse 19. The midwife said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous, and they give birth before the midwives come to them. They're just popping out their kids too fast. Why are there still Hebrew boys? Just pop them out so fast. We can't get to them. I just love that. But here's the thing. Pharaoh still views this as a problem. Until that changes, it's going to be treated as a problem too. And so if the midwives aren't going to do anything about it, let's expand. In verse 22, it says, then Pharaoh commanded all his people, every son that is born to the Hebrews, you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live. When you stop treating people as people and you start treating them as property, see, now Pharaoh has given every single Egyptian, a group of people that we've already seen are terrified about the growth of the Israelites. He has given them carte blanche to go ahead, and if you see a Hebrew baby in his mother's arms, take it from her and throw it into the river like you throw away your garbage. There is no other way to phrase this. This is monstrous behavior. And you got to think that the fear among the Egyptians, if it's good enough that it feels to be mentioned in the text, it's got to be high enough that some of them took them up on it. The leader of an entire nation has just given full reign for the Egyptian people to deal with the Hebrew problem however they want to. Let's recap for a moment. Right? Feels like it's necessary here. This particular Pharaoh, who had no idea who Joseph was or what he did for Egypt at all, has started to see that the descendants of Joseph are expanding at such a wide rate that he gets it in his head they could turn against us, even though the Israelites have shown no signs of doing so. There's been no indication that they're even considering this sort of thing, but we got to handle this problem. And so the first thing he comes up with is, well, let's just give them all the hard jobs. Let's give them all the heavy labor. Let's treat them poorly too while we're at it. Because maybe if we do that, that'll be enough to kill their spirit. When that doesn't work, he says, okay, let's escalate things to full-blown slavery. Let's give them the absolute worst things that we can do. Let's stop treating them like people. Let's start treating them like property. And then by the natural logic, when that still doesn't work, well, then let's just cast their babies like you throw back a fish. That about cover it? I want you to think about something about this particular chapter. And I'm going to guess that for a lot of you in this room, this is probably not the first time you've perused your way through Exodus chapter 1. Right? I'm going to guess it's, if you grew up in Sunday school, you know what's up next. You know how the rest of this book plays out. That's great. Even if you didn't grow up in Sunday school, you at least know the next main character we're about to get. Or at least have some idea of who he is. And so it's so easy for us when we become familiar with stories and narratives, particularly in the Bible, that we don't think about really what's going on below the surface. But I really want you to stop and think about, what did the Hebrews do to justify this behavior? What is their crime that now we're allowing the murder of innocent children? What heinous act could they possibly... I'm serious. I really want you to think about this. And I'm going to give you the answer, but I'm going to give you a minute to think about it. Go ahead. I'll wait. If the answer you keep coming up with is nothing, congratulations. The Israelites did absolutely nothing. And yet they're made to suffer anyway. The only thing that I can come up with, the only crime that they could ever come up with is because Jacob and Joseph got their happily ever after. And because Grandpa and great-grandpa moved us all down here, and we had the audacity to make a life for ourselves. Now we're being forced into slavery. Our children are being ripped from our arms. They have done nothing to deserve the way that they're being treated, and yet they're being made to walk through pain and misery and heartache. And here's the thing, guys. This thing lasts hundreds of years. Full-blown centuries pass with this treatment being enforced upon these people who did nothing wrong. That means that there are people who are born, who grow up, who live their entire adult lives and ultimately die as slaves. The only thing they know in their life is pain and hardship. And you got to think, right? I mean, these are the people of Abraham. These are the people of Isaac. These are the people of, I'll say his name one last time, Jacob. So you got to think that they are trying to comfort each other. They're trying to find some way to get through this misery. And so they're trying to come up with these platitudes that might encourage one another. And so they say things like, hey guys, God's going to get us out of this. God's going to be with us. You'll see. God's going to make this right. Can we ask a tough question? You know me, I love tough questions. How many times do you think they had to listen to those platitudes before they just became numb? Or worse, how many times do you think they had to hear God's going to be with us before they became cynical? Because if God's going to be with us, then why isn't he with us now? If God is going to help us through this whole situation, then why doesn't he do something right now? If God cares, why am I walking through this pain? And that's the question, isn't it? That's the question each and every one of us asks 1,000,000 times in our lifetime. I don't presume to know what everybody in this room is going through. I don't have that ability. But I'm going to guess that there are some of you in this room who have had to walk through unimaginable pain in your life. Emotionally scarring situations, things that you still think about even though it's been a year, 10 years, 50 years ago. You still think about it because that pain is still very much within you. It's one of the few things that in life that we are ever guaranteed, right? Guaranteed 3 things: death, taxes, and pain. Although taxes are kind of pain, so. We're guaranteed those things in our lives. One of the first sensations that doctors believe that babies ever experience is pain. And a great many people die in pain. So from the time you're born to the time you die, hey, guess what? Here's pain. Sometimes, let's be real, sometimes that pain is of our own choosing. We never like that one, right? We made a decision. We thought this was cool at 15, 16, 17 years old. And now at 50, 60, 70 years old, we're having to deal with the consequences of that choice. I don't know about you, but teenage Brandon is a punk, and if I could get him, I'd slap him across the face several times. He thought he was so cool jumping off that stuff, and now 40-year-old Brandon has back problems. So. Some of that pain is our own choosing. Some of it is because it's the result of somebody else's choices. Somebody in our lives, family member, somebody close to us, spouse, made a choice, right or wrong, and we have to walk through the consequences of that. But sometimes, that pain is just stupid random. It just happens. You're just going along your day being fat, dumb, and happy, and bam! Everything shifts. It's the diagnosis you never saw coming. It's the cherished loved one suddenly gone. It's the job that you loved handing you your walking papers. Clear, random pain. And so it's no wonder that we spend a large portion of our lives wondering, why would God allow this to happen? Where is God in the midst of this pain? They're questions that we wrestle with our entire lives. We want our best to try to make sense of senseless pain, and so where is God in the midst of all of this? Where is God when I have to deal with the physical, emotional, psychological, and even spiritual pain that I have to run the gambit of my entire life? Why, if God cares, would He allow this to happen? Please hear me when I say this. Because what I'm going to say next may sound like I'm trying to write off your pain. I am in no way, shape, or form trying to minimize anybody's pain. Right? I've had to walk through pain in my life. I'm guaranteed I'm probably going to have to walk through it again. I got pain I'm still unpacking that was forced upon me decades ago. I've asked those questions myself. Sometimes people get it in their heads that pastors just must be super spiritual and they never ask those questions. We're human beings. We're flesh and blood. We ask those questions just like you do. I've asked those questions of where is God, why is God, 1,000 times in my life. And so please hear me. I am in no way, shape, or form trying to minimize the pain that you are walking through. But that being said, I think we're asking the wrong question. See, we're so focused on where is God and why is God, when the real question we should be asking is, when is God? See, the real question that we should be asking as we walk through the pain and the misery that life has to bring us every single day of every single moment of our lives, the real question that we should be asking is, when is God going to do something good with this? Particularly as followers of Jesus Christ, I think we should be asking that question of when is God going to do something good with this? Right? Because we know as the followers of Jesus Christ that Scripture teaches us very plainly in Romans 8:28. It tells us that we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to His purpose. Now we have a tendency to misunderstand that Scripture a lot, right? A great many Christians have misunderstood that. A great many pastors have made really nice livings off of exploiting their misunderstanding of that. We take it to mean that if we love God and God loves us, well, then God is only going to give us good stuff. But that's not what it says. God tells us instead that he will use all that stuff for good. It's a huge distinction. Right? If we believe that God is only going to give us good stuff, well, then the second that we encounter pain, we're left with either the guilt of thinking we don't love God enough, or we're left with a theological debate in our head of, is there actually a God because bad stuff still happened to me? Right? Believing that God only does good stuff in our lives is going to cause you even more pain. But when we look at what the text actually says, and it says that God can use all things for good, well, that's a different perspective entirely. Because that means that the pain that we feel, whether it's our own choosing, somebody else's choosing, or just plain old random, that somehow, some way, God will use that pain for good. And if we're patient enough, that's a tough word for us. If we're patient enough, we might actually get to see God use it for good. I have seen in my own life God use my pain to help somebody else. Why did my parents get divorced? I don't know. But I do know that it's allowed me to speak some truth into people's lives whose parents have gotten divorced. Why did God cause this to happen in my life? I don't know. But I was able to give some advice to this person who was walking through that same thing. God has this beautiful way of taking even the most random pain that we have and still somehow using it for good. And we see this to be true just because of Jesus himself. Right? Scripture teaches us very plainly that Jesus came to this earth, he lived, he walked, and he breathed as a man. And so it is logical for us to conclude that Jesus himself walked through the same pain that we do. Even to the point that he went to the cross. And we know for a fact that God used that pain, the worst physical pain that human beings had come up with up to that particular point. Romans were really good at finding new ways to inflict pain on people. And God took that pain and he used it for the collective good of the entire stinking world. And so if God is willing to do that with the pain that Jesus walked through, why in the world would we think he's not going to use our pain for either our good or for the good of others? So why am I walking through this pain? I don't know. Where is God in the midst of that pain? He's there. The real question you should be asking is, when is God going to use this pain for something good? And I know it's hard. I know, I do. This sounds so easy for me to say up here. It does. It's not. It's not. I don't know how. I don't know when. I don't know why. But I know from my own experience that eventually God will use the pain that you are walking through right now for good. Do you trust him in that? Trust is hard when there's pain. So my best piece of advice I got is just hold on. It's coming. It's just a matter of when. Because God does not abandon us in our pain. It feels like that sometimes, but he doesn't. And we know that because after some time, God began his plan to deliver the Hebrew people from the Egyptians. Exodus chapter 2, verses 23 through 25 tell us, and we will close out with it today, during those many days, the king of Egypt died. And the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery and cried out for help. Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God. God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. I love verse 25. God saw the people of Israel, and God knew.